Welcome to Growing Ecommerce. I'm your host, Mike Ryan of Smarter Ecommerce. Today, I'm joined by Sam Tomlinson of Warshawski, a boutique marketing agency in the U.S. Sam's also teaching at Johns Hopkins University and Georgetown. He's got a head for numbers, and I think you'll get that. I caught him while he was attending SMX Munich, and we discussed the conference briefly before diving into Sam's views on forecasting. He clarifies the importance of forecasting, then dissects different options from cohort-based to Bayesian to regression, and he emphasizes that forecasting is not out of reach. Then we switch gears and we discuss the intersection of large language models and search. It's not a new topic to this podcast, but here's a new perspective. Sam explains where he's not quite as convinced and why. And in case you're listening in the future and you've got GPT on a chip implanted directly in your cerebral cortex, granting you godlike mental abilities, then please look kindly on us mere mortals. These are just our opinions here and now. All right, let's get into it. So, Sam, thanks so much for joining me today. Would you get started with a quick intro? What are your skills? What themes interest you?
Sure. So, Sam Tomlinson, I wear a couple hats. Biggest one is I'm executive vice president at Warshawski. We're a boutique digital marketing, performance marketing agency focused primarily, again, digital channels. We do a lot of branding work and we do a lot of, I would say, overall marketing strategy, growth strategy, right? Helping brands actually build a business, not just doing creative stuff, just doing any of that stuff. So that's a huge part of what I do. I run our digital team, our analytics team, work with our COO to run the overall agency. So that's a kind of a full-time job. We last year launched a venture fund, which is a private fund, which is kind of cool. It's myself, our COO, and our CEO and chairman. It's just us. It's just our stuff, which is great. And, you know, we've been doing so much work and working with venture for a long time in various capacities. And finally, we're like, you know what, we should just do this. And we should, you know, put some of our money on the table because we felt confident enough and we believe in what we're doing enough to do that. And then I teach at Georgetown and Hopkins. So, you know, you work all day, you teach a little bit at night, help prepare the next generation of marketers. I think I'm sure you've probably seen the same thing. It's really hard to find great talent. And the easiest way to find great people that you could bring into the agency that you can help grow is to teach them. And I mean, I think all of us have benefited from people that were willing to share their experience and their knowledge. So I have a little bit. I know a little bit about a little bit. So I like to share what I know with other people.
A little bit about a lot, or even a lot about a lot, based on my experience, Sam. And yeah, I mean, actually, not just flattery, but I think you sometimes get a criticism that marketing curricula are not really that up to date. The university world, the academic world, is a bit too slow moving and a bit out of touch, and so on. So I think it's just going to be really exciting to have someone like you on faculty and to be in one of your courses. At least if I imagine myself as a younger man, I would be super thrilled about that, I'm sure. But
it's fun, right? You get to kind of, in fairness, I work with two great organizations, right? Like Hopkins is phenomenal and Georgetown is incredibly open. And the reason I'm able to do the things that I do in those classes is because they've taken that old school mentality of, you know, tenure and, you know, you can't do this and you can't do that, to like, you know what's actually best for our students and how do we prepare them for the world that they're going to enter, not the world that we think that exists. And I wish more institutions would take that approach with how do we prepare our students to succeed, and who do we have to bring in to help them do that? And if they did that, I think maybe higher education doesn't get the flack that it currently does in terms of cost, in terms of value, in terms of desired outcomes. But I'm just one person and I'm just happy I get to do a little bit.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, great endorsement of those universities too, because I think there is a lot of administrative bloat in higher education and that focus on pragmatism and real preparation. That sounds great. I mean, and while we're talking, just for context, at the time of recording, because I'm not quite sure when this episode will air, but you're in Munich, not that far from me. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend. It's at SMX Munich. And yeah, we're expecting our second child right now, so I'm not allowed to travel right now. But tell us a bit about that conference. what's how big is the conference? What was the atmosphere like? Because it's been a while since SMX was in person here in Europe, at least. And I'd also just love to hear, you're talking about, pragmatism and the value of ongoing education and stuff like that. Like, how did you perceive the content that you saw at this event? And just tell me a bit about that.
So from what I heard from Sandra, who's one of the organizers, and I think this matches about what I saw. Obviously, I didn't have my calculator out, but there's like between 1,000 and 1,200 people here, so it's a good sized crowd. Overall, I would say it's been one of the better put together search conferences I've been at. They did a very nice job in terms of there's a really diverse agenda. There's some very solid speakers, nice mix of agency, of in-house, of platform people, which is kind of what you aim for, right? Because like I have one perspective as an agency, and my views don't always translate, and sometimes I prefer to always assume that people have good intentions and they're not trying to screw everybody. But sometimes it's helpful to hear that from the platforms, like, hey, this is why we did this, and it's not bad. So having some of those people here is great. The quality of the content, I think it's any large conference, right? There's a number of great sessions, and there's some sessions that are in the middle of the bell curve, and there's some sessions, but that happens, right? And that's part of learning is seeing all of this and being able to take from that what's valuable to you, leave the rest. And I think anybody that came here and actually went to some sessions left smarter than when they got here.
Yeah, good to hear that feedback. I just feel like the search conference scene right now feels a bit like an endangered species. We're seeing Search Love dropping off the radar, HeroConf dropping off the radar. So,
well, that's really one conference. I mean, it's all Brain Labs, right? So
yeah, that's right. So,
I mean, that's they have to make a business decision for themselves. But I mean, I guess the opportunity there is the flip side, right? Like for so long, the U.S. search scene has been dominated by SMX and Hero and Search Love, and now there's an opportunity for somebody to do something, and I think there's a need for it. So I'm excited to see if there's a brand that can step up to fill the void. But maybe a little, sometimes a little blendering isn't bad all the time. At least I hope not.
Yeah. Evolution or creative destruction are one of these concepts maybe coming to mind. I mean, yeah, these events are quite costly, and Brain Labs, I think they don't want to be quite perceived as too like pigeonholed into search or something like that. So it wasn't working out for them. Fair enough. But
yeah, I mean, it probably wouldn't be the decision I would make, but I don't run Brain Labs, so
yeah. I'll let that person speak for themselves on this podcast maybe one day. Otherwise, none of my business.
Exactly.
So, like you had a session as well, and you mentioned before the call you were on a keynote panel as well, which I didn't realize. So that's really cool. We'll talk about that later. But your session, this was called Future Forward Forecasting. So, kind of, I think I detect a pun there because forecasting is always future forward somehow. But what's your intent with that title? Are you suggesting that there's a kind of forecasting that's not future forward?
So I think a lot of it is, when I was thinking about forecasting, it's one of those areas where, as automation increases, you get to a place where hands-on keyboards becomes less important, where, machines start handling more and more. And as a marketer, you have to figure out where you fit in that. And I think a fundamental component of figuring out where you fit is figuring out how you can help and you can become the smart person that a smart machine needs in order to do something great. And whether that's, grow a business that you work in, whether that's work for your clients and to get better results, you need to figure that out. And to me, the big disconnect has always been that so many marketers talk about marketing things, and so few marketers talk about things that a CFO or a CEO or an investor would want to hear about. And I think forecasting has this really interesting role where it can be the bridge between what you do from a marketing standpoint and what instructions you give to a platform and what reporting you give to an executive or to a stakeholder or to a client that actually resonates from a business standpoint, from a financial standpoint. And it's so difficult because, like, I polled the audience here, and it's certainly not a unsophisticated audience. It's search marketers. It's a lot of people that are agency executives. It's a ton of big brand management. There's a lot of really good people here, and like almost 80% of the people aren't using a forecast or don't know if they have a forecast or not. Like, to me, that's mind-boggling. So a lot of the session was really geared around, like, hey, number one, let's actually talk about what it is, like how forecasts work. Then, let's actually break this down a little bit. And here's how we think about forecasting. Here's how, we work to make those forecasts. And here's how you can do it too. Because I think if you have a forecast, it creates accountability. It unlocks a ton of great things in terms of what you can report to your clients and how you can do your job better. And I think from a marketing standpoint, it positions you as somebody who is now able to maybe take that that leadership role, right? Because you're going one step above. You're going from hands-on keyboards to, hey, what am I telling the computer to do? How does it connect to the broader business context? What should I be aiming for? And I think having a forecast really does help you not just move your organization forward, but move yourself forward, right? In your career, and position you in a place where you don't have to worry about some stuff as much. But I also just think forecasting is fun.
It's funny how many businesses are operating in a mode that's really not that planned, or maybe they feel that it's not even plannable. And we just, speaking from my perspective, I've often seen unclear goalposts or moving goalposts. And yeah, this is just something, like you said, having that bridge to the CFO, and particularly in this economic environment, having some level of predictability or just scenarios at the minimum is so important.
Yeah, I mean, we use it. I think for us, it's been a huge unlock because I make the joke, right? Like, that we don't ever, when you start an engagement, you end up with a goal, and you start with a goal and a budget, right? And there's not a plan really. You have to kind of figure that out. And like you mentioned, there's some shifting goalposts, stuff moves, and then you get to a point at the end where everyone's like, okay, well, what did we get for this? And you have a meeting where every chart goes up and to the right. Did that happen? I don't know. Like, what should you have done? I don't know. Right? And everybody's had that meeting where it's like, things are great, but that doesn't always match reality. You're like, okay, well, how do we start to connect what it is that we're doing to the goal that we're trying to achieve? And how do we know, I think more importantly, when we're wrong, when something's not going right? And for us, that's always forecasting, because you can build a forecast. We build them at an ad group level, right? You can build a cohort-based forecast. You can figure out where your revenue is going to come from. You can figure out what efficiency targets you need to hit. You can figure out what the confidence is, or the acceptable error, right? With what's the variation in this. You can figure out where volume is. And if you do all those things, all of a sudden you're in a place where you can say, hey, our click-through rate was down a little bit, but it's still within the margin. We don't have to touch it. Like, there's not a reason for us to meddle here, but our conversion rate is materially lower than what it needs to be. It is outside the comfort range. We need to prioritize doing that, because if we don't, we're going to miss our target. Here's how we're going to now action that. Or, hey, our search impression share is just way too low. Okay, great. That's something we can action. We can either raise budgets, or we can go do more keyword discovery, and we can find more volume. Let's do that. And you can start to do some really exciting things in terms of prioritizing what you're doing, communicating to a client in a way that actually resonates, and providing clients, I think, with a framework in which they can assess results relevantly. So we report everything versus a forecast, right? And we show them the range. So, I think one of the big challenges is always people make categorical forecasts, a point forecast. We're going to get 55 leads this month. Well, if you get 54, you did okay. Like, you didn't miss, right? But we show clients, like, hey, you're going to get between, say, 45 and 59 leads this month. Okay, that's the acceptable range of error, and we're comfortable with that. So then you don't have a missed forecast. We're like, no, we were actually in the middle of it. It wasn't maybe directly in the middle. It was a little high. Who cares? But I think you position clients to think a little bit in terms of outcomes being a little uncertain. And what we need to do is trust that directionally we're right, and trust that we are doing it in an efficient way, and we're hitting our targets in terms of, not exceeding a maximum cost per, or if you're e-com, a minimum return on a certain SKU, right? But that's for us something that's really interesting, and it's really helpful because it grounds everything that you do in a financial reality for your organization, but it allows for the uncertainty of the world to not cause over meddling, right? And I think we all talk about that. Like everyone's like,
yeah.
It's a habit breaker in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. There was a discussion about this online recently where different names were coming up, like thermostat effect or cold shower effect, or I can't remember, several different, but everyone knows this phenomenon of just basically, fiddling with the dials or stuff like that needlessly. And this stuff, it's like, why are you taking the action that you're taking? Is it outside of normal variance? And is that outside of what's acceptable to you? So I love that as a diagnostic tool and as a prioritization tool, as you mentioned. I mean, why don't you run us through some options here? Because I believe in your talk you discussed cohort based. You mentioned this now, Bayesian, regression. Like, what could you give us kind of a little pocket definition of these, and then maybe we can expand on that a little further.
I mean, if you start with the most basic, right? Cohort based forecasting is, we look at everything in terms of cohorts, which are just groups of stuff based on some category. It's usually, or some qualifier. It's usually time based. We'll look at customers based on their cohort when they came in. The reason we do that is because it adds a lot of stability to the forecast and it allows us to predict behaviors a little bit better, right? Like we know if you go straight D2C, right, a cohort based forecast, customers that come in, you can do monthly cohorts or whatever. They tend to repurchase at relatively stable rates throughout the year. That allows you to build a forecast on retention that starts with your most stable and you build up on top, right? We call it a forecasting pyramid. So, on top of that, we build our owned audiences, which is like anybody that we have contact information, we don't require a third party to talk to. Email lists, SMS lists, old customer lists, any of that stuff, right? We know you, we're cool, app installers, etc. Then we have our rented audiences, which is anything on social, organic search. Those are things that we require a third party for, and they're less stable than any of the two levels below. And then at the top is your paid acquisition, right? That's your most unstable side, because when you're at the mercy of the ad markets, you're certainly at the mercy of platforms. There is no certainty at all. You don't even necessarily know who you're talking to. At least with, a social following, you can figure out who's your social following. That's not even true for the ad market, right? You can figure out what they're supposed to be, but maybe not who they actually are. And if you're doing like a broad audience on Meta, who you're talking to, right? So for us, we think about a cohort-based forecast as a way to introduce stability and sufficient granularity so that we can make informed predictions about expected behaviors. And we don't end up in a situation where an average is hiding an insight, where we're able to be sufficiently granular to enable diagnostics, but not so granular that, it's just sand running through your fingers, right? That's the analogy I make is, sand, something being too granular, like a kernel of sand, it just makes a mess. Like no one likes to go to the beach because sand gets everywhere and you don't know what to do with it. But if you put it in sandbags, it's actually pretty useful. So we want to make sure we have sandbags. But that's how we think about cohort-based forecasts. Bayesian forecasts is another technique that we usually add into this, right? So the cohort is just kind of how you think about the units of granularity. Bayesian is just something that uses Bayesian inference, which is you think about the probability of something happening versus a frequentist approach, which is, if you ran it 1 million times, how many times did certain things happen? I mean, there's material differences, and I'm not going to make light of a long-standing statistical argument in academia, but for us, it's just, we like to ensure that we think in terms of probable outcomes, not in terms of certainties, right? Because there's nothing certain in this world. So it's a way for us to introduce variability and uncertainty into a forecast, and to ensure that as our forecasts are projected, we are, number one, learning from our priors and updating our priors as you go forward. But you're also providing clients with, like I mentioned before, that range of possible outcomes. Like, hey, look, 90% of the time the outcome's going to fall in here. And if it doesn't, then that's possible, but it means we did something bad, and we should probably think about and figure out what's going on. And then regression, Another technique we usually use to forecast different, we call them atomic elements, but click-through rate, conversion rate, cost per milli, right? Regression is just a really nice way to use historical patterns to figure out anticipated future values. And there's 1,000 ways to do it. But you can, and I can mention my talk, right? Like, even if you know what this stuff is, you just have to be able to know how it works. And like Forecast Forge, if anybody knows Richard Fergie, he made a fantastic tool that uses Profit, which is a forecasting algorithm. You can grab any number of Google Sheets editions that will just do it for you, as long as you know what to ask it for. And in this case, it's a regression or a logic regression. Great, you can do this. It's not. I think a big part of what I was talking about at SMX was, number one, forecasting is incredibly powerful. Number two, it's not just something you should be doing once. And number three, it's something that's accessible. Like, you don't have to feel like it has to be super complex. It just you have to understand kind of the components, the Lego blocks. And once you understand how the Lego blocks work, like, anybody can make something with Legos. You don't have to be Kirk and, make the Star Destroyer. You can literally just make a nice little house, and it's cool.
Yeah, exactly. And well, now just connecting some dots here, because you just mentioned this Lego metaphor, but earlier you talked about these things like CPM and so on as atomic elements. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah. So we think about. Yeah. So I think part of it is because we build. So think about the idea of granularity, right, in a forecast, and it's always tempting to just forecast revenue, but that doesn't tell you much, or it's tempting to forecast just conversions, and that doesn't tell you a lot. So we think about it as, okay, what are the levers where we can actually do something? Where are the transition periods where one thing gets converted into another? And that's a place where there's an opportunity, a point of leverage for a marketer to step in and say, hey, this is why the end result is or is not where it should be. And for us, there's really 4. And if that's not just for us, it's literally math, right? Yeah. Any bidding strategy you use, there's how much you're paying for the impression, right? Search is CPM converted to CPC, right? Sure. It's everybody kind of works on CPMs. So how much are you paying to get in front of people? It's how effective do you convert somebody looking at something that you did into a visit to your site? How effectively do you convert a visit into a conversion, a purchase, a lead, whatever? And how much are those actually worth to you, right? Like how much are you paying to do all that, right? CPM, CTR, CPC, right? And I guess the other one, candidly, is how much volume is there, right? That's more a search question than it is a social question. But if you understand how much search volume there is, if you understand how much you're paying for that volume, if you understand how effectively you convert it, and you understand how effectively you convert those visits into things, you actually get a revenue number, or a leads total, or a contribution margin total, however you're going from there. And I would encourage you to go as far up the value chain as you can. But we think about these as, you forecast each of those elements, right? And then you combine those into the actual forecast, because then, again, you go back to the example of, like, we have a client where they expected 55 leads and we got 54. Okay, we're within the margin of error. But if we had returned with 35, right, well outside the margin, and the client's like, okay, well, you can't say we missed our lead target by, we were at 35 versus a predicted average of 55 within a range of 45 to 60, just random numbers, right? We can say, hey, the reason why our leads were lower is because our conversion rate on the website was 40% lower than expected. Here's what we're going to do to remedy that. And now, yes, you've had a bad period, but number one, you were able to detect the problem early. Number two, you could pinpoint which point of leverage you have to insert yourself in. In this case, it's the conversion rate on the website was bad. So either that means the traffic was garbage, or your site sucks, or both. And you can actually, work on that problem and say, here's what we can do. Here's what we can action to improve that. And now I think you've become a more strategic marketer, right? You're not just pushing buttons for fun. You're actually saying, hey, this is the atomic element. This is the core component of that outcome that is causing the deviation. And here's how we're going to insert ourselves into it to address that concern.
Makes total sense. Like, if you view return on ad spend as like a molecule, and then you could decompose that to cost per click, the average order value,
Exactly.
the conversion rate. And then if you'd be looking at marginal ROAS, then you could bring volume into that as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really cool way of thinking about it. I like that idea of elements, or like atomic rather, because you have these more complex metrics, decompose these into the smaller components, and that's where you can actually take action.
I mean, it's all about, I think in service before you said, like, you want to avoid the helicopter marketing, right? You want to, make sure that you're allowing the machine to make acceptable errors, and you're not over meddling in resetting learning phases, and you're not doing these things that conventionally we've always talked about doing, like, going in there and meddling, but you're just being a more strategic marketer.
Yeah, I like this term, helicopter marketing, like helicopter parenting. I'm definitely adding that to the list. Yeah. Thanks for walking us through those definitions.
Sure.
and getting into that bit. Like, now, if we look at those three things that we just mentioned there, like cohorts, Bayesian, regression, it sounds to me like you're layering these and using them together, or like, where do they, if you would imagine kind of a 4-box model in your mind, and there's like effort on the one hand, low to high effort, and then value on the other hand, low to high value. Like, do you think it's right to categorize them in a way like that? Or are there in-qualifying or out-qualifying criteria? Like, no, you're too small for regression, or, how do you determine what's appropriate? How do you decide that mix?
So, I mean, part of it, I think, comes down to a few fundamental questions, right? What data do you currently have? If you're a startup with no historical data, a regression doesn't make any sense, because what are we regressing, right? There's nothing there. If you're a big brand that's got a lot of clean data, then a regression probably makes a ton of sense, and we can use that to really accurately understand where we should be or where you've been historically, and determine opportunities for improvement, or opportunities that were just outsized performance, right? That's a great option. In terms of, I would say, impact versus effort, I think the biggest impact you're going to get is going from 0 to like a decent forecast. Like, that's huge. And I think it's often underlooked. Just, you don't need a fancy tool. You don't need a data scientist. You don't need these things. Like, there are templates out there for budget forecasting, for e-commerce, for SaaS, for B2B lead gen. Like, we've made derivatives off of Lightspeed's base model, which is available for free. You can literally download it. It works in Google Sheets. Like, it's not complicated. I mean, I use that for my Georgetown class because it's just so good. And just going from 0 to something, I think, is a huge, huge opportunity. Like, that's, if you make those 4 boxes, like low effort, high impact, there it is. It's literally a Google Sheet. If you can use Excel and type on a keyboard and ask a few questions, you can do this in 3 hours or less. And now you actually have an understanding of your business. So, I mean, to me, that's the huge piece. And then, as you become like a top performer, right, then those marginal points become exponentially more valuable in terms of like size. But you don't let perfect become the enemy of the good, is always my advice. Like, start somewhere, be a little wrong, and try to be a little less wrong tomorrow. If you can do that every day, you will be fine.
Yeah, I think that's an important message, and hopefully kind of inspiring to people who are maybe intimidated by forecasting or afraid to dip their toes in the water there. And it reminds me of this, these famous truisms from George Box, like, no model, there's no such thing as, all models are wrong, I mean to say. And to his point, he says you have to find out where they're importantly wrong. And I think that's what you're bringing across here. That's progress over perfection, and just one step at a time, and not letting yourself get blocked by the idea of forecasting.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the critical piece, right? Being willing to start and try and figure it out. So I hope more people do, because it's a huge, very powerful tool for PPC.
While we're in this kind of space, what does growth kind of mean to you? Like, what does good growth look like to you? How do you identify unhealthy growth? Is it through adherence to the forecast, or could you, is there a time where you might say, this is not aligning to the forecast the way that we expected, but I think anyway that it's okay what we're seeing?
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, I'm going to say something that's maybe controversial. I think revenue is easy. I think contribution margin, I don't think you can, getting to profitable is a tricky thing. And I don't think profit scales the way people think it does. But if you think about contribution margin, so right, your top line minus all of your variable costs associated with that top line, just contribution dollars that you can drop in, that's hard. And that's growth. Because fundamentally, anybody can grow revenue. I firmly believe that. Like anybody can spend enough money to grow money. Like anybody can send out $1 to bring back 50 cents. That's not hard. I think true growth comes from sending out $1 and consistently being able to bring back more than that dollar, whether that's $2 or $1.20 or $1.50 or 10, like whatever you are in your journey. And for each organization, that number is different. So to me, it's all about contribution dollars. It's how much money are we bringing in after we've paid our variable expenses. And that measure works B2B and B2C, right? Like if you're B2B and you're selling services, you have associated costs with servicing those clients, whether those are headcount or whatever. You just have a higher number of contribution dollars that you're dropping. And conversely, you have a higher base of fixed costs that you're dropping those contribution dollars into. So it's okay. It's the same fundamental thing works. But to me, it's all about, are we creating growth that works for the business and that helps the business get better over time? And to your point about forecasting, yeah, I think the forecast has to ladder into that. And it gives you the guide rails to know when you're in healthy growth and when you're in unhealthy growth. And, maybe when you're not sure where you are. And that's, I think, often contribution dollars are a lagging indicator, right? It happens after you've already done the thing. You've sold the product. A forecast helps you understand if doing the thing, the thing that you're doing is going to result in you being sad or happy at the end of it. So having those two that are in lockstep, so to speak, so that the forecast accurately reflects the business reality and can give you insight before you do the thing if the outcome financially to the business in your bank account is going to be favorable or not. That to me is incredibly powerful. And that's what unlocks good growth, which is positive contribution margin growth, right? I think we've all been trained to say profit, and it's like,
yeah, I know it gets super tricky because there's definitions vary, and then also the psychological connotations vary. And you're saying one word and someone is hearing something very different there. Yeah.
Right. So I think everyone more or less speaks contribution dollars relatively consistently. So I think that's probably the best one to get to. And I mean, again, every business is different. Like your profit is going to look different depending on your business structure and whether you have debt or you don't, and how you CapEx stuff or if you don't. Like it's just complicated. So if you go to contribution dollars, everyone understands it, and it's as close to profit as you're going to get reasonably and consistently without inviting accountants into the room.
To your earlier point, the difference between doing forecasting at all versus not doing forecasting is just huge. And the difference between, getting to contribution dollars or euros or pounds versus revenue versus, getting to some ridiculously, contribution margin 7, let's say, some level right down there, trying to get toward net profit.
Incremental return is just it's so small. There's such a small incremental return there versus the return that you get from just going from 0 to something.
Yeah, so is this broadly healthy, and is this also in a way that's based on my actual business numbers and not just based on platform numbers, which are typically going to be revenue based.
But those also allow you to give platforms the right numbers, right? Like if you understand your business's number, like Google doesn't know your business. Google doesn't care about your business. Neither does Facebook or Meta or whatever they've decided. Now that we're laying off the Metaverse team out, not they're still Meta, but for parts of it.
Let's see.
Right. Oops. But they don't care about your business. They don't know about your business. So right. You only you know that. Only you know what your acceptable tolerance is for what you can pay in terms of a target CPA or a cost cap. Only you know that. And, Google's going to use whatever Google uses in order to determine, what they think it's worth to you if you let them. So your job, I think, as a marketer is to put Roomba in a box, right? To make sure that the Google Roomba or the Meta Roomba just doesn't make a mess of stuff. And by having a forecast that's actually grounded in a business reality, you can do that.
Yeah, this reminds me of something Kirk Williams, previous guest of the show, said once, where he was saying that they had to sort of reorganize their living space a little bit to make it more Roomba friendly. But this is, and nobody exactly wants Roomba dictating the way that they live, but also maybe you have to meet somewhere in the middle. But yeah, the point is giving an environment, a structure that the Roomba can understand. If we're going to compare Google AI to Roomba.
It's pretty fair. Maybe a little charitable sometimes.
I'll leave that for another time. But one thing I definitely want to cover with you, switching gears a little bit, but I think you mentioned that there was a keynote panel here for yourself, but you're not as impressed by ChatGPT as others. Is that right? Or how would you describe it?
The fairest way to characterize my position is I think LLMs are a fantastically interesting technology. And ChatGPT and search more generally is just not a very interesting application of them. I think there's a lot of hype, and that's been here too, 100%, about ChatGPT and the future of search. And I don't see ChatGPT as the thing that breaks search or changes search in a materially interesting way. Does it replace featured snippets with AI generated content? Sometimes, maybe. Okay. But we had the same discussion back in 2017 about voice search, right? Where it was going to change the world and everyone's going to, oh my God, it's going to be amazing. And Amazon just shut down part of their Alexa team. Like, do I think LLMs have a lot of potential? Yes. Do I think they do really exciting things? 100%. Do I think they're more of like an enabling layer, kind of like a database, or if you think about like a cell phone network that you can build really exciting things on? Yes, 100%. Do I think they're like the next Instagram or something? No, I just don't. I think it's a huge, wonderful, creative opportunity to build the next level, the next set of exciting platforms on, which is cool. I just don't think search is the place to do it. And I don't think Microsoft's the one that's going to win. So,
I mean, I've got a lot of thoughts here because I think, Google is saying that like in their internal meetings, there's documents showing that they're really stressing that that AI chat is not search, that they're two different products, but that people may try to use it like search. I think there's use cases where it probably does replace search, and then there's probably use cases where it doesn't. And I think it's possible that the search market is going to get smaller as a result of this, but
maybe
it's hard. It's hard.
I guess there's a series of queries where ChatGPT is uniquely well positioned at the current moment to provide quality, right? But most of those searches are kind of not searches; they're more research, right? It's kind of like there are searches that you functionally use as an assistant that were never suited to be good searches. Okay, that's kind of obvious. Like, and I think when we talk about search, so many people talk about so many different things, and it gets this convoluted mess of search. And if you unpack search and you say, okay, wait, what are we actually talking about here? If it's, hey, I need to find stuff, like, yeah, Google's probably still better. Or if I want to explore a bunch of different options, Google's probably still better experience. And I think it's a higher quality experience. If you talk about, hey, I've got this article and I want somebody to summarize it for me, Google was never well suited to that.
Yeah. That's
yeah, like, and again, that's where I think there's so much potential for an LLM, and it's not in search. I just don't think search is a fundamentally interesting use case for an LLM.
I'm not sure, Sam, and I think it's moving so fast that it makes it hard to say. I hate to like waffle on this.
That's fine.
I'm going up and down the hype curve myself all the time. I can tell you, because when ChatGPT launched in December, I was super blown away. But then within like 3 weeks, I was kind of bored of it and not using it that much anymore.
Yeah.
And then now, like at time of recording, GPT-4 is new, and I'm looking at it's multimodal, so it includes image and audio, and I'm very impressed here. But I also I don't know. I don't know if it's fair to compare it to voice before, because it's possible that voice wasn't ready yet. It's possible that that these large language models could enable voice now and bring voice more to fruition than they were before. Or like, I'm just not sure. Or this idea that it's a layer in there. This could be, I think it's definitely going to be transformative technology. And it's hard for me. I don't know. Recently I saw Google Workspace or Google Suite, their whole productivity suite. Microsoft Office doing similar. They're showing the way that AI could be integrated into workflows. And I'm so up and down on it because it looks really impressive on the one hand, but you also see people like, it's in the video. They show someone not reading an email chain. They get it summarized for them, and then they don't write a response. The AI writes a response for them. And then, like, in the context of the video, it looks like that one user is kind of superpowered compared to everyone else. But you have to remember that everyone else will be doing the same thing. And it to me, it turns into this like muddle of, I feel like in the end, when I see that video showing those use cases, I think that the team that just directly communicates and actually reads and listens to and understands each other is going to outperform. But this could be reactionary of me. And maybe Google doesn't even... Yeah.
I think there's two things to this, right? The first is there are parts of search that are currently taken by search that are relatively poorly suited to search. And LLMs will chip away on them. Just, I think Amazon chipped away on product search, right? Because Google kind of sucked at it for a long time. And now Amazon does do a significant amount of e-commerce related search happens on Amazon. And candidly, the fact that Google did so many of these product searches for such a long time, I think was more a product of Google being a market leader in search, because I don't want to use the M word. I don't think that's actually a right definition. I think that's part of it. And that being pulled away is not a bad thing, right? The same way that, YouTube search has become really interesting for certain problem-related queries. But that search was never good for that anyway. If people want a how-to video, they shouldn't be searching on Google anyway. They should be searching on a video platform that can give them the content that they want. And I think LLMs are in that same class of, they will pull some volume from Google, but it will pull the volume that Google never should have had, but simply had because it existed and nothing else did. So to me, that's not particularly interesting. But then I think you get to these other questions of, well, what is it well suited to do? And I think large language models more generally have the same types of errors they're always going to have. So, we've seen ChatGPT hallucinate, and that's not going to go away, right? Because LLMs are uniquely well suited to matching a pattern. Like, you provided a question and it provides an answer that matches the pattern that it knows. Okay. And it's uniquely well suited to answering questions where being wrong may not matter. I mean, the thing I said here, and I think it's still right, is ChatGPT is fantastic at providing an answer to anything where being 97% right is all that matters. Right? But if you're in any type of query where 3% wrong negates the 97% right, ChatGPT is not your thing.
Yeah. This has been a huge topic. For me personally, I really value accuracy, and so for informational queries, it's not quite there yet. But I don't know to what extent, like, with AI, typically we consider that AI has a black box component. It's kind of inherent, and it's a problem that may get fixed with time or may not be able to be fixed. This explainability challenge, and with large language models, I don't know how inherent the hallucinations are, and if you end up kneecapping the capabilities that make it valuable by limiting those hallucinations.
Right, you kind of do. I mean, I'm not.
It's the point that it's generative, that it's creative somehow. What surprised everyone, how creative that it is, and it seems like you would have to limit that somehow, right?
Right. I mean, you're transforming really difficult problems for machines, which is like be creative, into a statistics problem, which is find the pattern, right? It's a vector map. It's to map this into a vector, find the other similar vectors, go team, right? Find the words most likely to follow. So in some sense, your kind of hallucinations are kind of inherent, right? In that you're pulling data from a corpus and you're using it to create an output that may be original in terms of sequence, but is subject to some of those hallucinations, some of like making up sources. We've seen that in medical journals, right? Where it cites an article, ChatGPT 3.5 and even 4 now, it cites an article that doesn't actually exist. And it's like, okay, or cites a study that never happened. And you're like, well, what? So that's a problem. I think part of the other problem is you need to find, we talked about this a little bit at the keynote here, is there's a component of ChatGPT, of any type of LLM, that needs a data input. It needs feedback from a user to tune the model. But at the same time, people are jerks, right? Like we saw Microsoft went through this like 5 years ago or 6 years ago with Tay, where it put out this chat bot that was so cool and had really interesting responses and did a lot of the interesting things. It did them in a very different way. But like in 2 days, Tay was like a racist neo-Nazi. Tay was horrible, right? And then it was 2 years ago, Facebook did BlenderBot 3 or whatever it was, and that one turned into like a crazy racist jerk. And when you're training a model on the corpus of data and it's the internet, like the internet isn't exactly like the warmest, fuzziest place all the time. So I think, part of it is you have to figure out how to do that. And the second is you have to figure out, ChatGPT doesn't understand the difference that like Avery is a person and chair is a thing, right? Like it doesn't understand concepts. It understands how words fit sequentially. It understands what's most likely to follow, but it doesn't always understand. ChatGPT has no understanding of what an arm is. It understands it knows kind of where to put it from a math standpoint, right? That's kind of the error inherent. And it's why it's great for a number of fantastic things. And it's for other things. So
yeah, I mean,
I just don't think search is the use case where it's going to shine. I think you have so many other exciting use cases that ChatGPT can do that pigeonholing it or forcing it into search, I think, is a mistake.
I think it's the first box that people have put it in, and people are going to find other use cases. And I think in the end, the ways that we think this will change the world are probably not the ways it will. Probably smartphone computing changed the world in different ways than we imagined. And but I really appreciate you sharing that take, because I recently had Mike Taylor on. Go back and listen to that episode if you've missed it, anyone listening, because he's more bullish, let's say, and you're a bit more bearish. So I think it's important to show both perspectives. Or not necessarily, I'm not saying that you're like, down on the technology, but on this use case of it, let's say.
I think that's a fair way to put it. I think probably the best way to put my position is I think the technology is incredibly promising and has a number of fantastic applications and can be used to build some really remarkable things. I just don't think search is the thing to build on.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for sharing that opinion with us. And unfortunately, we're at time, or I've got to let you go because that's fine. But it's not fair anyway. You've got to get back to the whole conference at Munich. So before I let you go, any shout outs that you want to give, any projects, companies, people?
So I would say the companies, project, people, but if you want to check out our agency, it's Warshawski.com. If you want to find me, I'm on Twitter. It's @DigitalSamIam, all one word, just that. I write a newsletter every week called The Digital Download. That's digitaldownload.samtomlinson.me. It's free. It's always free. It's just sometimes interesting, sometimes long. I don't know.
I'm subscribed. I give it my endorsement, and that's an endorsement, not an affiliate model. So check it out. Thanks, Sam, so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Of course, Mike. All right. Have a great one. Talk to you later.
Thanks. You too. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Growing Ecommerce. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider sharing it with coworkers, friends, or within your professional network. We really appreciate it. This podcast is produced by Smarter Ecommerce, also known as SMEC. To learn more, visit smarter-ecommerce.com.